Hello, hello, friend. Welcome to AB Adventures. I'm Amanda, and today I have some interesting details to share with you on the history of the prince from Snow White, Prince Charming, or rather Prince Buckethead? Yeah, you may not have heard of that nickname before now, but we are definitely going to chat about that in just a bit. So stick around for the history of Prince Charming surrounding Walt Disney's 1934 Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. It is no surprise that Disney films have often gotten some criticism for having flat princes without much character development in the few scenes that they had. I personally have found that some of my favorite princess films actually have a well-developed princely character as well.
Oh, you look so stupid.
We all like to see these characters with depth and uniqueness. Often the princes in Disney films were underdeveloped and thus underrated. The film Snow White really did lack this, but as I have researched the subject, I have found that this was not the original intention of the story developers and animators. Back in 1934, no one had created a feature-length film in animation. It was an entirely new field, one of which Walt Disney was bravely willing enough to try. With this in mind, many of the animators were venturing into new territory. They were highly aware that audiences could quickly disengage from a bunch of drawings playing on a big screen for over an hour. These drawings had to be spectacular and the story had to be compelling. So to start with this compelling story and to introduce some of our main characters, we have our heroine, a lonely but optimistic orphan, her evil stepmother of a queen who is originally looking for someone to love and to marry her, and a prince from a neighboring land who is looking for his future queen. Walt had intentionally included the prince earlier in the stories than the Grimm brothers had, since their version only had the prince randomly showing up at the end of the fairy tale. The story involving Snow White was pretty much solidified. However, this original treatment of the story had the evil queen seeking to not only be the most beautiful in the land, but have someone see her as the most beautiful and to marry her. Her eyes were set on the prince. The prince himself was seeking to have a wife who would help him rule the land. He had heard tell of Snow White and that she lived not far from him. He ventured away from his castle on a journey to meet his love. It was upon entering the kingdom that the prince would meet Snow White. There is actually a comic from 1937 that details this meeting, though I'm not 100% sure that this is how it would play out in the original story treatment. What is interesting about it, though, is that this comic was already in production before the film debuted. So, since we know that the prince's tale was different throughout the story writing process, could it not be that this comic just might show a bit of that difference? This comic had a scene where Snow White was cleaning and daydreaming about meeting a prince. She forms this scarecrow-like man and places a bucket on top for his head, naming him her Prince Buckethead. The prince appears from behind and says that he doesn't mind the nickname at all. This whole interaction creates an endearing first meeting. Now, back to the concept story, the queen would immediately become jealous that Snow White, whom the magic mirror had already declared was more beautiful than her, had won the prince's favor. It was this motivation, tied with that of wanting to be the most beautiful, that would cause her to send the huntsman to kill Snow White. The queen proposes marriage and the prince refuses. Honestly, I don't blame him. And the angered queen orders him to be taken to the dungeon until he chooses to accept her proposal, simultaneously ensuring that the prince would not try to save Snow White from the huntsman. He's restrained in the dungeon next to the skeletons of a former prince who, oddly, is named Oswald. As a quick side note, for those who are familiar with the former Snow White and Her Scary Adventures attraction in the Disney parks, these dungeon scenes explain the ride taking so much time in the Queen's dungeon, as much of the movie was going to take time in the dungeon too amongst the skeletons. For more on that, there is a segment about it in our previous video on Disney Dark Rides. You can watch it in the link up above. Meanwhile, the princess has escaped the woods and eventually to live with the dwarves. Here she sings "Someday My Prince Will Come," which actually had a dream sequence storyboarded with it, where Snow White would daydream about marrying her prince. It had this beautiful dreamlike feel to it that I really wish we'd gotten to see, and apparently the story sketches were combined into a short segment set to the song back in 1987 and shown at an event with guests and the original animators present. I wish I could find that, but alas, it has fallen into the void of Disney history. Back to the dungeon scenes. If those weren't scary enough, as soon as the Queen discovers that Snow White has escaped, she hatches a plan to poison the princess, telling the prince of her plan and that only true love's kiss will wake Snow White. She casts a spell to turn herself into an old hag and then floods the dungeon. Dramatic. Okay, now if you're thinking about this like I am, this may seem a little bit contradictory if the Queen wanted to marry him, but it does make sense when you consider that she knew that true love's kiss would awaken Snow White. Again, proving the point that she cared more about securing her status as the most beautiful than the most loved. As with so many Disney films, animals would come to the rescue, and in this case, there were a few little birds that would come to rescue the prince. Freed from the dungeon, he fought his way out of the castle by way of dueling with the guards, swinging from chandeliers, and all sorts of general action hero-ness. The prince, with the help of the animals, finds his way to Snow White. Rather than him kissing someone who has died, as thought in the movie, he knows in this version that she is merely asleep and true love's kiss will wake her. This makes the whole scene make a whole lot more sense, and I really wish it had stayed. So why did this not stay in the film? The problem was that the animators ultimately could not solve how to animate a convincing male hero. Remember, this is the first feature film that they have ever created, and especially with such a main focus on human characters, they tried repeatedly and still were not satisfied with the outcome. The testing and reanimating was costing the studio more money, and Walt decided to lessen the prince's appearances in the film, focusing more on Snow White and her story. Now, after the major success that was this film of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Walt put his artists back into school.
First thing I did when I got a little money to experiment, I put all my artists back in school. The art schools that existed then didn't quite have enough for what we needed, so we set up our own art school. Now, we were dealing in motion, movement, and the flow of movement, the flow of things, you know, action, reaction, all of that. So we had to set up our own school. And out of that school have come the artists that now make up my staff here, and more than that, the artists that make up most all of the cartoon outfits in Hollywood.
The talents of the Imagineers continued to grow in their new art form. They went on to create multiple amazing films like Pinocchio and Fantasia that really enhanced and showed off their artistic expertise and growth. Eventually, they got around to trying a prince again in Cinderella. Even more so, as many who loved Disney know, a good idea never dies in the Walt Disney Company. We all know this. And by the time of Sleeping Beauty, the animators took another go at animating a convincing prince and pulled from their old stories from Snow White to bring this prince to life. From the fun interactions with the horse before the prince meets the princess to the scene in the dungeon and the dance in the clouds, the animators finally got their scenes up on the big screen for audiences to experience and to fall in love with. And there you have the backstory of the prince and his nickname of Prince Buckethead. Thank you for watching. I so appreciate you. Don't forget to subscribe to hear about when we next release videos like this, because we have a bunch coming down the pipeline. And with that, I will see you on the flip-flop.